Are you worried you're on the wrong size bike? Are you about to buy a bike and you're torn between sizes? I'm going to try and answer those questions by explaining the differences between frame size and lean into my own personal journey about how I've switched frame sizes. Sizing is a super common question here at GMBN and it's super valid too. If you're making an investment into a new bike, you're spending your hard-earned cash, you want to make sure it's the right size bike. And getting the right size bike can make a really big difference, not just to how it rides on the trail, because, well, a bike that fits and works for you is going to ride better, but also for your physical fit as well, because getting the wrong size bike in terms of, the saddle height, the reach, all of these different factors can result in an injury. Many riders fall between frame sizes, even if brands do up to 5 or 6 different frames. And getting the right size frame is really important because you could have the latest suspension tech, the latest gears, but if the bike's too big or too small, all that tech will just go to waste. Bike geometry has gone through a revolution of late. We've gone slacker, we've gone longer, we've gone steeper in loads of different places. There's a lot going on with geometry. But before we dive into that, just want to say, if you like this video or you like the channel, then please do subscribe and give us the thumbs up if you like this video or others on the channel. Where and how we ride has really grown mountain biking in terms of the style of riding and the different segments. So we've gone from a quite binary cross-country or downhill to the wide variety we've got now, from flat bar gravel to down country to trail to enduro to super enduro and those binary cross-country and downhill. What defines the differences between those segments or categories? Well, that's probably a discussion in itself. But for me, I think there's 2 core factors, and that's travel and geometry. We need to pedal and we need control. We need to balance these 2 opposing forces. Those of us more on the XC side of the spectrum, well, some of the bike fit really matters, and that's pedaling. So where we sit in relation to the contact points that are key for pedaling, be those pedals or saddle and bars, it's really important because we've got to optimize our output. We're not like a motocross bike. We can't just twist for more power. So we've got to optimize how our legs and how we fit onto the bike. On the gravity-focused side of riding, what governs speed is being able to stay off the brakes. So you need control and stability for that. Trying to eke out the best compromise of these 2 opposing forces for your riding and your riding style, well, that's where the fun begins. There's lots of numbers, there's lots of different terms. We're going to try and explain them all because otherwise it can get really confusing. Okay, little bit of a background. When we started mountain biking, we borrowed roadie geometry terms, and that meant that we used the seat tube measurement for the top tube measurement, which was sort of useful, and you could use the bike standover as a good guide to how big the bike was. But it wasn't exactly right, and geometry changed. Then we morphed to using, t-shirt standing, small, medium, extra large. So one of the systems is pretty confusing, the other is oversimplistic. Saddle height is specific to your leg length and your flexibility. And on many bikes, it's relatively easy to adjust. And I don't mean the dropper height, I mean being able to adjust where the seat post is. And that's in relation from the saddle to where the pedals will be. So that takes into account crank length. So that bit's easy. What's more engaging is how this dimension, this front center changes. And actually it's not just that, it's also the height of the bars. So you might be able to fit on a number of different sizes with this measurement, but getting the bars in the right place in terms of height and reach away from you, that's more challenging. It's a multi-piece puzzle with numbers and angles all interconnected in a bit of a conundrum. It's a bit like how your height is made up of, not just your leg length, but also your torso length. It's all interconnected. Here's a brief 101. Head angle. This is the static angle that the forks pivot on. These have slackened out of recent times. Seat tube angle. This is a virtual number, but gives the angle from the bottom bracket to the center of the seat. These have steepened up in recent times. Reach is a virtual figure that runs parallel to the ground from the head tube and runs directly above the bottom bracket. Stack. This runs vertically from the same start point on the head tube down to the bottom bracket. Reach is often discussed, but it's only half the story. Why? Well, if you change the stack, which is the height of where your bars or cockpit will be, well, that effectively changes the reach as well. So these numbers are all interconnected. So changing one will change the other a little bit too. Top tube length. This is another one that sounds relatively simple, but it can be measured in a number of different ways, and that can be confusing. So the normal metric is that it's literally this measurement long here. But what you probably need to know is actually the virtual one, so a horizontal one running from the steerer tube to the seat tube. Head tube length. This one is pretty simple because it is just the measurement of the head tube. So on a mountain bike, things are a little bit more complicated because we've got suspension forks, and depending on what travel you've got on that suspension fork will also determine how high the front end of the bike is. So it's an important metric where if you're looking at a road bike, because road forks are pretty much all the same length, axle to crown, it's not indicative, whereas on a mountain bike, there's so much difference between that axle to crown because of different suspension travel. Front center. This, I feel, is an underused metric. We're measuring from the front axle to the middle of the bottom bracket. As bike geometry has changed radically and stems have got a lot shorter, that's changed how much we can play with stem length to affect bike fit. So we can't do what the roadies do and change stem lengths from maybe say 100 up to 140 because it would affect how the bike rides far too much. Bar width has grown massively since the binary days of XC and downhill, and we can still use it to tailor fit. By increasing the bar width, we can change our reach. We can make it slightly longer feeling. Likewise, if we shorten the bars, we can actually shorten that reach feeling up. Another piece of the bike fit puzzle is wheel size. 29ers and 650 are available, and, well, 29ers versus 650, they do ride differently. That tyre footprint makes them, well, grip and corner, and, well, the dynamics of how the wheel works is different. And some brands choose to fit different size wheels on different bikes. It might sound a little bit confusing, but when you think about the physics of fitting in quite a big 29er wheel and lots of suspension travel on a very small frame, you can see quite quickly how you might run out of space just for the bike itself, let alone any crotch clearance. Most brands have been really good at providing really detailed geometry charts and sizing guides. But what if you're like me and you're trapped between frame sizes? What's your option then? Why have I changed? Well, there's two core factors, man and machine. Man, well, what shape of human am I, or you? And machine? Well, geometry has changed a lot, and how does that interact with you? I've been riding quite a long time. I know, youthful good looks. It's the power of the bike. But one thing I learned early on, in old money, I was about a 17-inch frame. Wheel size did change. We went from 26 to 29, and there were some subtle geometry tweaks, but it wasn't radical. Yes, the ride dynamics were a little bit different, but things didn't move on a lot until we had the lower, longer, slacker revolution that was ushered in by Mondraker and then followed up with Geometron and lots of other brands. And all those measurements that you used to be able to rely on and work from for your next size bike, well, they melted away with this revolution. With this change in geometry, top tubes have grown and stems have shrunk, and that's limited a little bit how much we can play with fit. Where in the past we could play with bike fit quite a lot, we could adapt the fit to fit us, we could put a longer stem on. It was all at the compromise of how the bike handled, and with this new longer, lower, slacker geometry, we've prioritised how a bike handles over how it fits someone. And that means we've got to pay a little bit more attention to what the geometry is set in the frame, more so than in the past. How we make up the height we are and the range of motion that we have is all hyper-individual. Now, me, I'm relatively short, and I'm also made up of a lot of leg. What do I mean? Well, I'm about 172 or 5'6" in old money, but my legs are really long. Steve Jones is around 6'1" or around 185 centimetres, but we've both got the same leg length and saddle height. So no, Steve isn't short on legs, it's more I'm long on leg. The take-home isn't different leg lengths or worrying that I've got exceedingly long legs. No, the take-home is that we've got different proportionality, and that means how we fit onto the bike is going to be different. The other additional human factor is the range of motion. So how flexible we are, how tight our hamstrings are, or how tight our back is going to impede or limit our range of motion. So it's going to change how we fit onto the bike. For my height, I fall between two sizes of the Canyon Neuron, between the small and the medium, but there's also a wheel size difference between these two models. So for my overall height, I'm steered towards the small, and for my leg length and the saddle height, I'm steered towards the medium. We're going to run through the pros and cons of the small size one and the medium size one. So the small, well, the smaller wheels are a factor, but it's the reach and geometry that I think we need to look at the most. And some of the changes that make the bike feel different are from the wheel size. So the bottom bracket is in a slightly different position, not in terms of the ground, but in relative to the rear axle. And that means the bike is really poppy. It's really quite fun. The front end, I think because of the wheels, it actually turns in quite quickly, even though it's got the same head angle as the bigger bike. So there's wheel changes here and geometry changes. Overall, though, the bike does fit. It does feel good. And the cons. Okay, I think, again, it's related to geometry and to wheel size because, as we've discussed, it's all quite interlinked. But the wheelbase is shorter, and we've got that different contact patch from the 650B wheel. And that means that whilst it does feel poppy and it does feel dynamic on the trail, it lacks a little bit of confidence. So when speed gets high, I've got to really concentrate. So for some technical terrain, the advantages of being able to maneuver much more quickly and readily are great, but for faster downhills, it's not as confidence inspiring. Also, climbing. Even though I've got a kind of chunkier, knobbly tyre on the 650B bike, it feels like the rear tyre is searching for grip all the time, whereas on a 29er, it just finds grip. So the medium size, we've got to touch on the 29er wheels because that does change the dynamics of the ride. But I guess we can start off with talking about the reach and the stack. So these numbers are different to the small, but because my saddle height is quite high and because the bars are a little bit higher, it doesn't change the reach as much as you might think, even though it is technically a longer bike. That front and centre is longer, but because my saddle height is so high, the bars actually come up closer. So effectively the reach isn't quite as severe as it might be. Other stuff we need to talk about is the wheelbase. So it feels calmer, and some of that is because the wheelbase is longer. Some of that is because it's got 29er wheels, so the wheelbase needs to be a bit longer. One thing that I do find interesting is that the head angle is just the same at 66 degrees on both bikes. But on this bike, it feels much calmer, much more measured. It's kind of riding in the bike versus on the bike. It's not as twitchy. Some of that comes down to where the bottom bracket is in relation to the rear wheel. So the bottom bracket drop is deeper on this bike than it is on the 650B bike. And that does mean that you feel in the bike. It's more composed when it gets tough. And climbing, even though the bars are slightly higher, so effectively on paper you'd think it wouldn't maybe climb quite as well, because of the 29er wheel, it just grips, it climbs really well. Potentially it's the wheelbase too, because a slightly longer wheelbase can actually help climbing because it stabilises your weight shift. So the cons of the medium bike. Well, I think it's less to do with the geometry. Because of the saddle height that I've got and the bar height now being slightly higher, the geometry changes aren't as radical as I thought they'd be. And I think the bigger changes that I'm feeling in terms of how it rides are down to the wheels. And related to that, that calm and composed feel that the bike has a lot of the time is, to a degree, a negative, because it is so calm, it is so composed, it's not as poppy, it's not quite as fun, it's not as interactive. I think some of it's related to the bottom bracket height as well, because we've got more bottom bracket drop on the 29er, and that means it is harder to manual, it's harder to get the front up and over stuff. But because of those bigger wheels, they kind of roll over lots of stuff anyway. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground. We've talked about human proportions and how those differ between individuals. We've talked about revolution and geometry. We've also talked about how an industry that focuses on just a few metrics, we often actually need to look at the bigger picture to make sure that we're going to get the right frame size. So what size bike should you buy? I think a good starting point is to, well, do the maths on your current bike. Look at the saddle height. Is it actually optimized? Could you move your saddle fore and aft a little bit? Look at your bar height, look at your bar width, and think about all those changes and try and measure some of the geometry. Try and look at what the stack height is, look at what the reach is, and see if you want to go longer or shorter. Then compare, if you're buying a new bike or if you're buying a second-hand bike, to what the geometry chart says on those. And compare and contrast. Then I think you've got to do some real honest thinking and think hard and don't cheat yourself. Where are you going to ride? What style of riding are you going to do? And how do you ride a bike? Do you merit from the kind of smaller bike that is more agile, more dynamic, but can be nervous, can be a bit more of a handful? Or do you want the larger bike that most likely will be a little bit more stable, a little bit calmer? You've got to really think about where you're riding. I think younger me would have stuck with a smaller bike. I was more aggressive back then. I really took things to the trail. I tried to boss the trail, hopping, jumping around the trail and having loads of fun. And I rode a lot more then, so I was probably a bit more confident. And I was younger, so I bounced better. Now I'm a little bit older, hopefully a little bit wiser. So the bigger bike, with its slightly more stable, calmer demeanour, suits me better. So that's one of the factors that you really have to think about. But for me, the medium, the slightly more relaxed bike, that's the right choice. It can be a daunting process choosing a new frame and making sure that you get the right size, but it's well worth leaning in because that time spent, that time invested choosing the right frame size and doing the maths, doing the research will come back on the trail when you've got a bike that fits you and fits your need perfectly. So, if you've got any comments about which frame size to choose, or if you've got more tips and advice on how you chose your frame size, get into the chat in the comments below.